presentation. All right, well, welcome. I'm Carol Summerfield. For those of you who do not know me, I'm the Executive Director at the History Center, and I want to welcome you to the kickoff program for what is our new exhibit, which opens tomorrow. We got an open house from 1 to 4. If you can come in, and the purpose of the exhibit is to talk about why travel matters and the stories of travel over time. And with this exhibit, one of the things that we're doing is talking to some of the academic advisors who've been helping us frame this narrative and really think about how to approach this in a way that helps us build what is going to be a permanent online collection of stories of travel over time. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you, should I be able to move my screen forward, to Eric, who is from the University of New England. Oh, that's a little fast. And did some great books that really helped inform what we were doing. History of Modern Tourism is a great read. I'm going to let him talk a little as they do their introductions about what each of them are working on. But he has done a lot of editing of other people's work as well, and has a good sense of sort of the breadth of what the academic world is studying. Richard is from Pacific University, and he did one of my favorite topic areas, which is the backpackers. Having been one, I think that's a picture of him in the center, if I'm not mistaken, and sort of how that vagabond experience has informed travel moving forward. And then Linda, who did hitchhiking and really has a strong narrative around sort of shifting viability of this as travel, and has done a fair amount of work also in terms of when traveling goes south, not literally, but figuratively. And so, you know, as we talk, the goal is to sort of create for you a sense of framing of where this sort of narrative has come from. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can see everybody, and where the study is going, and why an archive like ours is going to be important moving forward. So with that, let's start with Richard, since you're in my upper left screen. If you want to unmute, you can talk about a little about what your current research is on, and you know, share a story or two.
Well, my current research is I'm following a sort of amateur explorer who, and I'm working on a graphic, at the moment I work on a graphic history. He's a minor French aristocracy, and he travels to the borderlands of Guatemala and Mexico to look for a lost tribe. The tribe was not lost, but this tribe was lost and found many times over the decades. So my current project has to do with this particular individual and sort of his adventures in various places. He's also the first person to kayak down the Green and Colorado rivers in 1938. And the surprising thing about that is he made a color film of it. And so color film wasn't even, Wizard of Oz hadn't even come out yet. So there's all this film footage. And so I'm sort of tracing his adventures in different places at the moment. But my earlier work, I came at the history of travel as a historian of youth and young people. That's what my work has been on. And so I was interested in the backpacking and travel from the point of view of young people's experiences, and you know, how that contributed to what I talk about in the book, sort of the way it sort of helped Europe itself integrate after the Second World War.
All right, Eric, you want to do the same sort of little presentation?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'll start with how I got into it. Well, how I got into it really has a lot to do with my own experience as a traveler. But I got in college really interested in nationalism and national identity. And so my initial work was really about that, about how it is that tourism informs national identity and vice versa. So the kind of symbiotic relationship that exists there. And that was what got me into it originally, writing about the history of Ireland and Irish national identity through the lens of tourism. And then I got interested in tourism. And you know, one thing's led to another in various projects that I've worked on there. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is actually working on getting other people's stuff into print and trying to broaden the field and bring in as many different places and experiences and angles and so forth to the story, because tourism really informs virtually every aspect of modern life in the modern world. We don't necessarily think of it that way, but it does. So actually, in the last couple of days, I'm super excited that this has come out, which is one of the first books on tourism history in China. And it's an absolutely fantastic book about how modern China was created through tourism and Chinese identity was negotiated through tourism. The author, Yajin Mo, has done a beautiful job with this, and we're just absolutely thrilled to have this in the book series that I edit. So that's that. And then in terms of my own stuff, well, we have a new baby, so things are kind of on pause, but I'm working on a number of different things. One of which is tourism in India during the Raj. There's not been a lot written about tourism in India, and so I'm kind of interested in that. But more specifically, I'm interested in Indians as tourists and how they picked up these kind of European models of guidebooks and things in order to express themselves as Indians within a colonial context. So that's one project. And then another that I'm kind of excited about is I've recently gotten very interested in old cars. I've got a couple of my dad's old cars, and I've found that driving them is a kind of a very, very different than a modern vehicle. I have a 1931 Model A Roadster pickup and a 1947 MGTC. And driving these cars is an experience that frames the landscape and creates a kind of relationship with the land and the road that's very different from a modern car. So I'm interested in how that shapes the leisure experience. And so that's another thing that I'm working on.
All right, thank you for that. There are a million things that you said I want to pick apart, so we'll do that in a minute. All right, Linda.
Okay, so in terms of what I'm working on now, I'm at the University of Guelph, which is just about 40 minutes from Halton Hills, the region of Halton Hills. And in that region of Halton Hills is the manse where Canadian author Lucy Maud Montgomery lived for a very long part of her career. She's best known for as the author of the whole Anne of Green Gables series, but she wrote, I don't know, 20 or 30 novels plus dozens and dozens of books of poetry. Anyway, the Lucy Maud Montgomery Society, who we call the Mod Squad because we don't know what else to call them, they've taken the manse, they purchased it, and they're making it into a house museum. And they've reached out to the University of Guelph because we have a lot of Montgomery's manuscript material in our collection. And so I've gotten together with a couple of colleagues, and we've got a research grant. And our plan is to work on house museums. And our plan for before COVID is we were going to rent a car and drive across America, looking at all the house museums and taking part in everything. We were going to go to the Laurie Ingalls Wilder Rodeo. We were going to do all we were really going to participate in everything. We were going to buy all the swag. We were going to drink the teas. We were going to buy the t-shirts. We were going to go deep into particularly women's house museums. But we've selected a sample of women writers who wrote about girls. And so that was going to be really fun. And it will be again. The fun will come. But anyways, that's what I'm working on now, women's house museums or house museums. And again, representations of the girl. That said, for 35 years, I have been working on girls in different ways, girls and women. My interest in hitchhiking, apart from the fact that that's how we got around when I was in high school and in university, that was something we did. But what happened about 10 years ago, it was just a throwaway line in a seminar. Somebody was writing an essay about a girl who was murdered in the 1950s, and they were talking about the court case, and somebody said, well, what they didn't mention in court was that she was a hitchhiker, and everybody sort of leaned forward and went, mm-hmm. And I felt attacked. I just thought, what the? And I said, whoa. And I said, no, that's how what people did. Ask your mothers, you know. And I left the room and I thought, wow. I just thought that has changed so much. And I just thought, that's amazing. So then I knew that I would do oral history interviews because I've always done interviews. And so I did a little bit of general research and I learned that hitchhiking, there's so many theories about hitchhiking. It's in history, it's in sociology, it's in philosophy, it's in psychology, it's in politics, it's in everything. Everything about hitchhiking hits some social institution. Anyway, so then I had a couple of TV interviews, a word of mouth, snowball sample. It just every time something happened, it was so easy to find people, particularly baby boomers, that generation of baby boomers, of which I am the tail end. I'm born in 1960. People were just coming everywhere. They just wanted to talk about their hitchhiking trips. And so I just started kind of putting the stories together. And I found that for every story that was about democracy and joy and celebration and pleasure, there were the same stories about danger and assumption and assault and violence. And so again, when I put the story together, I sort of led with the positive and closed with the negative. So I decided I didn't want to be that person that was encouraging young women to get back out on the road again. But in the course of the research, I did look at the 1930s and to 1970, but between 1968 and 1974, hitchhiking goes from being the best of all possible worlds to the worst thing that you can do.
And it's interesting because all three of you touched on this idea of how travel sort of changed, or how one aspect of travel has changed. You know, Eric, you mentioned this idea of the way the road feels under a 1940s or 50s car is really different. And, you know, I know my mother is on, but I have a memory of being in a 1964 Ford station wagon that had the little triangle window as we were going through Yellowstone, and having a bear reach its claws around that little window after we'd rolled the big windows up and just started rattling the car. You don't really get that experience in something where you can push a button and the windows go up. So, you know, one of the things we really wanted to accomplish with this exhibit was talking about both how travel does inform the American identity, but also how it has changed and why it's changed. So, you know, Eric, let's start with you and that story of why the road feels different under an older car, and we can sort of, you know, freeform this conversation around why has it changed, you know, and what are some of the threads that we want to pull forward as we look at these narratives?
So tourism more generally, or cars? Because there's a kind of different answer there. With the cars, you know, we now have much more sophisticated suspension systems and a variety of other things. I mean, so taking the question of tourism, I mean, for one thing, it's a pretty modern phenomena, right? And it's come into existence and developed and become something we can't live without, which I think we truly believe. Maybe it's true. But it's happened in conjunction with the development of modernity. And as we have become more modern, as new technologies have come along, as we've learned to see the world in different ways, tourism has reflected those changes and developed as a result of them. So I think that's one of the reasons that things have changed. Simply the world has moved on. Tourism has pushed that and reacted to it at the same time, reflecting just about everything that you can think of. Political systems. Political systems are very much reflected in tourism, and various political regimes and ideologies have used tourism in particular ways to sell their ideologies. Our sense of who we are has evolved with time, with our ability to move around, to be mobile, to encounter other people, to experience things in real time versus longer durations, etc. Tourism has been a part of that story. I mean, I suppose I could ramble on for quite a while, but I think that's how I would certainly start to answer that question.
Excellent. And Richard, one of the things that you mentioned, which I also know we tried to pull through, is this idea that the backpacker, right? This invitation that becomes a democratization of travel, where it becomes more accessible, is a two-way street. It's built out of the need in Europe after the war to sort of invite people in who don't expect sort of the, blue, the white collar experience. They're not looking at, people are going to get white glove treatment. And so they have to find a new audience. And with backpackers are one of them.
Well, the impulse there. So two things on that. So you mentioned earlier, thinking about the centrality of tourism to the American experience. And I think a lot of Americans think that backpacking in Europe is an American thing. And it's not. It wasn't an American thing. The Americans really arrive in significant numbers by the late 60s, early 70s, but it starts earlier with young Europeans. And so there's an impetus right after the war to welcome young people from abroad, all kinds of, exchange programs and twinning of cities and all sorts of programs trying to reconcile after the Second World War. And these sorts of programs start to shift and change. Like they established all kinds of visa protocols, allowing young people to travel on a joint passport and all kinds of supports like this. And then eventually it flies out of that and it becomes independent travel. And so that's when we really start to see the backpacking is in the 1950s and into the 1960s, as you start to see young people independently traveling, lots of hitchhiking, as Linda knows. And then you end up with the rail passes. And so the rail passes, which don't really come into existence until the late 60s, early 70s, facilitate crisscrossing Europe, ignoring borders. And it does become a democratization of travel and tourism, and not always an unproblematic one, but.
Right. And then Linda, I know one of the things that we've talked about in the past is, this idea that young women, right? Part of this evolution of women being able to travel is women being able to travel independently, that in the 1920s, if you were married, you couldn't have your own passport. You were on your husband's passport, and you get this sort of evolution of women being able to move much more independently than they had been ever before.
Is that, you want me to comment on that?
Yes, yeah. I would love for you to comment. I'm sorry, I could frame a question.
What I noticed in my research was you're right in everything you say. Yet there have always been women on the road. And in the 1920s, hitchhiking was something the flappers did. During the Second World War, it was a respectable way for what they call them defense debutantes to get back and forth from the militia factories where they were working. Miss Manners? She talked about sort of patriotic ways to hitchhike. Always wear your uniform. Don't talk about your private life. You never know if there's going to be a spy. And that's the 1930s. But there was also during the Depression, women were on the road. In many cases, dressed like men, looking for work, traveling on the highways. Just to add, though, what's interesting about the roads is that although they're paid for by taxpayers, they're built by working people. And a lot of roads, particularly in Canada, were built during the Depression as work projects. And so people feel like the roads are theirs. And even though the car is private property, as Eric just pointed out, there's an entitlement that that road, which is ours, be shared, right, by somebody who's driving. So you have a car, and again, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, this idea was if you pass somebody who was thumbing a ride, you really felt an obligation to stop and give them a lift. Because again, you probably knew them, it might be a neighbor, but there was this idea that you should share, right? So with hitchhiking, the ritual of hitchhiking is that it's sort of a begging gesture, right? Like praying hands or whatever. The thumb is sort of a version of that. It's a let's go sort of feeling, but it's also a gesture of charity. So the driver, somebody passing you, they have a choice to make. They're going to interrupt their day. They're going to stop. They're going to pick you up. And the assumption with hitchhiking is that particularly for women, is all I want is a ride, right? I don't want flirty conversation. I don't want a date. I don't want alcohol. I don't want you to say dirty words to me. I don't want those things. I just want to ride. Yet the driver, who was sort of the master of the machine, might be making assumptions about my character, a woman, maybe alone on the road, you know, and so they're thinking that in exchange for, so when charity works well, the ritual's great. Everybody has a good experience, but when it goes south, there's these assumptions are made, and there have been assumptions made about women on the road, right? That they were either running away or that they're some kind of misfit or psychologically damaged. What I did find early in my research was a lot of psychological studies of girl hitchhikers, particularly in the early 1970s. And it's professors on American campuses who are seeing all these girls, right, hitchhiking up and down, back and forth, and they're confused. And I saw sociology professors, psychology professors, science professors doing surveys with their female students. And they always assume that they're, you know, sort of sexually liberated. They probably have, you know, liberal values. They might support, you know, students for democratic freedom or communism or something. They come up with these profiles to explain why their students are engaging in these behaviors. A lot of professors also ask young women what they were reading. And it's very clear that these young women in the 1970s are reading feminist books, like Kate Millett's books. And they decided that these young women have been reading about feminism, and they're starting to think that certain virtues that have always been prized don't mean anything, don't matter anymore. That they're not afraid of losing their virginities. It won't be the worst thing that happens. So that what happens in the car then becomes kind of a contested space. So it was kind of interesting that this idea that I found early on that that social workers as well as psychologists really did think that there was something wrong in the minds of these girls, that they were asking for trouble, right? They're bad girls, stupid girls asking for trouble. And they're unlikely to complain about a sexual assault or abuse because they're not really supposed to be there anyway. So It gives the drivers this carte blanche. So yes, but there's also. Go ahead. I was going to say, but in my interviews, I had the most amazing stories, but the best things that a lot of women on the road experienced. But male or female, whatever happened by the end, statistically, they would always say it. The rule of the game was that sooner or later, male or female, you were going to get a bad ride. And they talked about bad rides. They talked about radar, you know, having ride radar.
So what I find so interesting about this, and I'm going to pull Eric into this, is this sort of assumptions around women and how women are going to behave. And then we're going to go back to the Grand Tour, because one of my favorite parts of your book was talking about the realities of the Grand Tour versus what it had purported to have been. So Eric, I don't know if you want to touch on that and explain to the audience, you know, what the sort of demise of the Grand Tour had become.
Yeah, so the general consensus among most tourism historians at this point is that tourism, modern tourism as we know it, begins as a very elite pastime in the 17th and particularly the 18th centuries. And the idea was that young men who would ultimately be the ruling class of Europe, Northern Europe mostly, would go off and they would meet their counterparts abroad, and they would learn languages, and they would learn to develop a broad taste in food. They would develop taste in terms of how they would decorate their homes, what architecture they would appreciate, what art they would buy. It was going to be this, like, and they were young men, say 16 to 21 years old, and they would have a tutor that would go with them who would help assure that they met these learning outcomes, as we now refer to them. And the reality was rather different. They were predominantly young men. Some women went, and that's very important, and we should mention that. but most of them were men. It's the time, of course. The reality was somewhat different. They were 16 to 18-year-old men. Usually the tutors were people who had failed in other walks of life. They didn't really care very much. So what they did is they went to Europe for anywhere between 3 months and 6 years. And they drank a lot, and they gambled away ridiculous amounts of money, and they pursued prostitutes, and they learned very little in the way of foreign language. They basically learned to speak with bad accents and to wave their hands around, which drove their parents nuts when they came home. It was not the best scene. And what ends up happening as a result of that still sticks with us. First of all, there's the idea of travel and enjoying yourself and leisure, but the idea that tourists are some kind of baser level of human comes down to us largely from that experience, because there was a great deal of tension between the idea of the Grand Tour and the reality of it. Now, I say that it's important that women went on the Grand Tour too, at least some did. And the reason that they tended to do that was they wanted similar opportunities to what men had. They were the people who wanted to learn, and they genuinely wanted to learn. It seems. I don't think Mary Wollstonecraft, who's one of these people, was doing a lot of drinking and gambling while she was traveling. She was developing a lot of ideas that would come out in vindication of the rights of women and things like that. They were seeking opportunities to escape from the patriarchy they knew at home, to escape into new experiences. And tourism offers that to this day as well, I think, that idea that you're going to escape and grow. So there's been this tension right from the start, which is, I think, really the thing that's interesting about the Grand Tour, at least to me.
All right, and I'm going to throw this out to the group of you, and you answer as you feel free. One of the things I find so interesting about sort of the cycle of how travel goes. So when I was a traveler, and I know all of you sort of have your personal experience that pulled you into these stories, when I was traveling in my 20s, when you pull into a train station, there'd be a group of older women there saying, come stay in my house. And for $10, you would go stay in the pensions that they had, which in my mind is like just a cheaper, easier version of Airbnbs. But, this idea that you would go and you would actually stay with people, I think was a large part of travel for a very long time. And I don't know if any of you want to comment on that, but that's part of what Airbnb does, is bring that back and just sort of structuralize it.
One thing I noticed with my interviews is people talked about their address books a lot. People had an address book. Some people still have their address book. And everywhere they went, they would collect addresses. And they didn't think much about rolling into a city and showing up at the door of somebody they'd met, 3 weeks earlier somewhere else, or 3 years earlier at some different point. People would also talk about, showing up on the doorways of third cousins twice removed and relatives. And there was this idea that I don't know if we still have it in our culture, where you just felt like you had a right to show up on the doorstep of any relative, anyone with the same last name as you. They did kind of have a tendency to, and I just noticed that this idea that you'd make a reservation and pay to sleep somewhere was the last thing on anybody's mind, with the exception of the youth hostels. And even then, there was a lot of rules in a lot of youth hostels, as Richard mentions too in his book as well. But yeah, there was this idea that you wanted to do it as cheaply as possible and to go as far as possible for as little money as possible. And that becomes your travel story. That's something you can exaggerate and brag about, because it shows you've kind of got a certain,
savviness.
Yeah, that I'm the kind of guy who can just go anywhere and the doors will open and people will give me free stuff. But
I'll bring that back around to the Grand Tour. A lot of people think about backpacking as just the modern form of the Grand Tour, because particularly the association with young people, the association with self-improvement that it's connected to. But an important dimension is what Linda was just pointing out, which is a striking contrast to the Grand Tour. As Eric mentioned, very often the Grand Tour, they would have entourages with the really wealthy would have entourages of people, and it was very pampered. And of course, as we know, the backpacking ethos is much more, how cheaply can you do it? How long can you stay on the road? That sort of thing. And the important distinction there is class, is social class. And so a longstanding tradition in Europe was associated, journeyman. In the guild system, a journeyman, the reason it's called a journeyman is because laborers would go on a tour. The original Grand Tour of France, the Tour de France, actually refers back to apprenticeships, that you move around learning from other masters, whatever it is you do. And in Germany, this was called the Wanderjahr, the wandering year. And so the 20th century backpacking that we think of is really sort of those two things sort of coming together. It has parts of it that's a bit of the Grand Tour, but it also has parts of it that are bits of the Wanderjahr, and it has so much to do with resources and social class and the ideals and values that go along with that. Another thing I'll add about that is you didn't see in the second half of the 20th century when we see backpacking emerge, it wasn't a rich kid pursuit. The rich kids didn't really bother with this stuff so much. It was overwhelmingly middle class and working class young people who were doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, backpackers would have a lot of trouble with the Grand Tour. I mean, there's the Grand Tourists were told to spend as much as they possibly could. And you get stories about Grand Tourists who have like 600 pieces of luggage, which would be really tricky to get into even a 3,000 cubic inch backpack. I mean, that would be a big task. Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of tension here, I think, right? Because what ends up developing with modern tourism is that component of it that it is mass tourism, that there's sort of large numbers, and a lot of things play into that. The development of guidebooks, for example, in the 1830s, that tell you they tell you, as a quote that one of our tourism historian colleagues pulled out of a guidebook, they told you what ought to be seen. And they not only told you what ought to be seen, but they told you how to see it. They told you where to stand. They told you what was relevant about it, what mattered, etc. And so you get these stories about people who are following their Baedeker, following their Murray's Guide, and never looking up from the guidebook to see the stuff around them that they were supposed to be looking at. And of course, that's an idea of tourists that we still have today, and the sort of package mass tour, which is also developing around that same time, where everybody, Tuesday, it must be Paris, Wednesday, it must be Milan, kind of figures in. So, and that's the sort of practice that attracts the most ire, I think, right? That's the unthinking tourist. That's the kind of lower class, not necessarily in monetary terms, but sort of lower being, versus the traveler, who really should also be described probably as a tourist, but we want to make a distinction. And so we sort of see them as a sort of higher class. They're off the beaten track. They're out there having real experiences with real people. And so they're backpacking, they're hitchhiking, they're seeing stuff that isn't in the guidebook. They're having conversations with people that are really getting at the heart of the place where you're at. Whereas if you're on a package tour, you're probably not getting that. Although, I don't know, I watch a lot of PBS, and it certainly sounds like those river cruises are, at least sold in such a way that you're going to be baking bread with an elderly lady in Budapest, which I doubt. Although maybe I should take a tour before I comment. So, I mean, I think that's kind of interesting. When we get into the 20th century, particularly in the post-war, the area that Rick and Linda are talking about, there's also a splintering of tourism practice, because we get into a truly consumer society in a way that hadn't existed before the economic miracles of the post-war. And the way that was expressed in tourism was the development of niche practices. So different types of tourism that you could engage in that expressed who you were personally. So now you could, by the practices you were adopting, by the decision to go out and backpack around Europe rather than doing something else, or the decision to hitchhike around Europe rather than doing something else, you could say something about who you were. Yeah.
And I was going to say, and that expands then into, I'm going to go live on an ashram, or I'm going to go do yoga practices, or I'm going to go, cook with the French chefs. And, there's this interesting sort of, again, splintering that happens where I get the Lonely Planet, I'm going to Bhutan on my own. Then you get Abercrombie and Kent, I'm going to Bhutan, but I got a package group. And there is this sort of evolution out of that, where all of a sudden remote reaches or remote practices become something that's more accessible depending on how you want to approach it.
But we're missing something. We're missing a key thing here that obviously I know Eric and Linda both write about this quite a bit, and that's the more mundane tourism that results particularly from the mass adoption of the automobile. And if we're talking North American tourism, I mean, wow, the automobile transforms and opens up tourism and tourists and changes tourist practices and opens up tourism. I mean, just the motel, the motel is exactly, comes out of that. And you don't have Disneyland and you don't have Disney World if you don't have, masses of North Americans with cars.
Well, and when we were doing the map exhibit, which just came down, one of the most interesting things was finding out about the sort of transcontinental routes, is that these were things where associations basically pulled those together. So the Lincoln Highway was a bunch of people in Chicago who are just like, all right, we're going to go out and we're going to take bribes for you to be on my map. And so you spend, if you followed the Lincoln Highway map, you spend 100 more miles in Utah getting to the coast than you had to, because so many people bought their way into that map. And it's interesting, even, I've done a lot of national sort of traveling in a car. You can stop and see the world's largest frying pan or the world's largest statue of, whatever. And it's interesting, this desire to pull tourists in. The Corn Palace is an amazing thing altogether. And wasn't really driven by tourism initially, but they had to find a way to cultivate it. And if you've never been, every year they decorate the outside with a new corn maze, and it's amazing. The inside is just basically a flea market. But there is this sort of Americana that comes out of the desire to pull tourists in that change, I think, the dynamics of the way America is structured.
Part of it's that in the post-war, there's an emphasis on family. And so what these car trips were all about was really the American family vacation. And kids, as I'm learning firsthand, have fairly short attention spans, and you've got to do things to entertain them. And so you got the Lincoln Highway, or you got Route 66 or something. You need entertainment along the way, and families will stop even if the entertainment's not that good, because they need it. And so that means a sort of proliferation of experience. Now, I think as well, though, because cars are available in various price ranges after the Model T comes out, it's part of a larger trend towards kind of democratizing this experience. It's no longer the very rich that need to do it. And so you get people with all sorts of levels of cultural capital, a kind of fancy intellectual academic-y term, but all this kind of sense of the world around them and the things that they reference as they're thinking about that. All kinds of different types of that because of the different social groups that are involved. And so that has the effect of changing the experience and changing the landscape, quite literally, that they're going to encounter. Can
I just add to that? We haven't talked about the performativeness, right? Performativity, how do we say it? Of the whole thing. When I was doing my interviews, 2 points. First of all, I asked people to describe what it was like to be in the car, to talk about the cars. And what I discovered is that through the interviews, that the car itself was a character in their story, in their narrative. The shape of the cars, they all talked about the cars as big as boats, and where you put the backpack in order to maximize your personal safety. You put the car, you get in beside the driver. You put the backpack between you and the driver. You don't get in the back seat. If you get, it talks about the backpack a lot, but I also asked people what they put in their backpacks. And this is what I found the most fascinating. With all the interviews, people could remember exactly what they packed. And if you go back to all of the photographs that you had when you were introducing us, right? We've got lots of photographs of travelers, and people were very specific about what they wore. In the late 19th century, as Richard was saying, I think, people started tramping, right? The Victorian middle class in the late 19th century, rather than copying the grand tours of the elite, they started to copy some of the journeyman travels of the poor. And so there's lots of examples of sort of a late Victorian middle class young adults dressing down. They dress like tramps and they go on adventures. And they try to stay in workhouses. They want to stay in lodging houses. They want to sort of be among the poor. They want to get next to the dirt. That's part of the fetish of the late Victorian middle class young people. But what I noticed with my hitchhiking, with the hitchhiking research, during the 1930s, because of poverty, because of the Depression, hitchhikers dressed up as much as they possibly could. Comb your hair, brush your teeth, carry a razor, wear a blazer, or maybe a college sweater if you can find one, you know, shiny shoes. They talked about that, but the hippies, they dress down because they are middle class. So they create this persona, this way of dressing. So again, they have like weirdo hair and big bell bottoms, and they decorate their backpacks with American flags or Canadian flags and badges and a guitar case or something that makes them look controversial. And so it was really interesting, I thought, that how specifically they remember what they wore. Because again, you want to create this identity, this new identity, a new self, because you're on a rite of passage. You know you're not going to be the same when you get back. So you need to, you're gonna play it up. And so again, people were very, and the descriptions in newspapers of all of these kids lined up down the highway and really derogatory descriptions of how they look. But I just thought about one thing about stopping, Eric, that you may be too young, I don't know, to remember. But when you've got both parents chain smoking and no air conditioning, you gotta stop. Because it was pretty bad in those cars sometimes.
Yeah, thankfully, I'm from a family of non-smokers. So.
Well, yeah, well, but that was part of the interviews too, or the drunk drivers. Everybody was picked up by a drunk driver. We were raised by drunk drivers. Drunk drivers were a real issue, a real part of, and the chain smoking, right, was a real interesting feature of life inside the car.
The stuff on fashion's utterly fascinating. And I would love to see a book proposal come across my desk for something on the history of tourism and fashion.
I have a chunk in my chapter, but just
expand it. I want to see the book proposal.
Yeah, that was a pitch there, Linda.
Yeah.
All right,
yeah,
so
yeah.
we're at quarter two, so I want to open it up to the audience. There are two ways you can just unmute and ask a question, or you can type it into the chat if you would like, but feel free to participate in the conversation with us. And so let's see, I can go to view and see if anybody's raising their hand. Otherwise, I will just keep asking questions because, as you know, I can talk forever. So, you know, one of the things that I find fascinating about that idea of trying on identity, oh wait, we've got from Dennis. What are your views on study abroad for college students in terms of the way that fits into the sort of travel narrative?
I could start with that. So a few interesting things about study abroad. Study abroad has always been and remains overwhelmingly women. 2/3 of study abroad students who do it and have done it are women. And in fact, study abroad was developed for women. In the 1920s in particular, the junior year abroad, studying in France, I think it was Delaware, and another school in New England. I can't remember right now. One of them starts with an M. Anyway, so study abroads were designed to have a structured experience, a chaperoned experience. And so the original sort of protocols built into study abroad were for women students. And it remains the case that overwhelmingly the majority of students who do study abroad are young women.
That's so interesting. What do you think is the sort of impetus for young men not wanting to do study abroad, given that there is adventure in it?
Well, contemporarily, universities in general are we've seen in the last few decades more women going to higher education as students than men. So you have a declining contemporarily, you have a declining gender disparity just in the number of the student bodies themselves. And so, the young women tended to study languages, foreign languages, more than men, and study abroad was, very strongly connected to language study. That's another big factor.
One of the things we didn't really touch on is sort of the diversity of who's traveling and looking at what the, African-American experience was and is, or particularly around travel abroad, and how in the 1920s, it started to sort of change what their expectations were of what should have been allowed in the United States and was not. And I don't know if any of you want to touch on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's a developing area of scholarship. So there is a forthcoming book, unfortunately not in the series that I edit, that is on African-American travel abroad. And I've heard a couple of papers that come from that book, and it's really very fascinating. The experience for African Americans in the United States was, and I think this has become much better known in the last few years, was really rough. The reality was that many restaurants and hotels and so forth didn't cater to African Americans. They would have to go well off the road. They were simply not welcome in many places, and this necessitated the Green Book to help guide them around. And there's even an argument that LBJ was inspired by hearing from his cook about the experience of what it was like to travel as an African American, and that was one of the inspirations for the Civil Rights Act, which seems to me to be a pretty kind of credible story. The experience of studying abroad, as I understand it, had some significant tensions as well, particularly in crossing the Atlantic, because you're traveling very often with the same people who don't want you, to step out of your place back home. But once abroad, it could be absolutely eye-opening. And of course, the experience of going to France for many African Americans was a revelation. I'm a big jazz fan, and Miles Davis talked a lot about what it was like to play there and not really wanting to come back, because he was getting beat up outside of clubs when he went for a smoke at home. But when he was there, he was welcomed and a hero, and it was a very different thing. So I can't wait until that book comes out. I imagine it'll be out very soon, and then we'll have a much better picture of that. One of the big trends in the development of the scholarship right now is to talk about race a lot more, to talk about gender a lot more, to talk about the environment a lot more. So all of those things are being fleshed out. The general narrative, and we've kind of touched on it today, is of democratization, more and more people being able to travel. That's true, but more and more people were able to travel on the backs of the people who couldn't travel, and those people were overwhelmingly Black and brown and so on, and their stories haven't been told. That's fortunately starting to change.
Well, I think that's one of the most exciting things, both about having you all here as panelists, but also about, being able to do this exhibit and watching where this sort of study is going is it is getting broader, it's getting deeper. I think it's informing a lot more our sense of sort of the sociological impacts of travel and how it has shaped us. You know, if I love the fact that there are all these new narratives coming out. If each of you want to talk a little about, you know, some of the things that you've read or where you see this going, because I'd love to have the audience also know what there is out there to read on this.
Well, I'll kind of jump in, I guess. I mean, the kind of narrative arc of the story of tourism history is, in the 60s, there was interest in the grand tour, but not because of tourism, because it was kind of finishing school for the very rich. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, it was a more Marxist inflection. And so it was about the working classes going to the seaside and the development of seaside resorts. And then something happens in the late 1990s. And suddenly there's stuff about politics in tourism, about fascism in tourism and communism in tourism. And as soon as that, and national identity in tourism, and as soon as that happened, the lid came off. Because as I said at the beginning, this is really a story that's intertwined with all the sort of elements of modern existence. And so if you're interested in environmental history, well, tourism has a pretty profound impact on the environment, both a literal impact on the environment, which you wouldn't necessarily think of. I mean, the next book in the series we have coming out is about the construction of the French Mediterranean, of the French Riviera, and it will freak you out when you start reading about the environmental stuff that was going on there. It's crazy. So there's that, but it shapes how we view landscape and how we think about that. And so there's stuff to be done there. At the moment, the big trends, I think, are we're seeing more and more on places that aren't Europe or the United States. So there's a much bigger kind of geographic frame. The book on China is a good example of that. We're seeing more and more stuff on race. That environmental history of the Mediterranean also involves a lot of North African labor, and they were treated very badly. So we're getting that story. We're seeing more on labor, just in general. We've studied a lot about tourism. We don't necessarily know a lot about the people who worked in tourism, and so we're starting to see more and more stuff on that. And yeah, and then beyond that, we're tons of different stuff, the construction of different museums and different heritage experiences and how that's developed and changed things. Transportation and the implications of that, how the cars shaped things, automobility, youth tourism. I mean, Rick's book a couple of years ago is a good example of that. And I think there's more stuff coming out on that. So, I mean, that's the sort of things that I'm aware of and seeing.
Yeah, I was thinking of the lifestyle mobilities. I reviewed an edited book on lifestyle mobilities, and it was all about sort of groups of people going places and doing phenomenal things, like the storm chasers, dirt bags, the climbers. What are some of the other ones? Like the deep sea fishing things and ice climbing, and are going to symphonic music concerts and these sort of lifestyle mobility. So people getting together and sharing these experiences by doing sort of unusual things.
Yeah.
What I find is that the theory in this mobility theory, it gets so, for me, I'm just an old-fashioned Marxist sociologist, and I find that the theory gets to be so dense that I don't know what they're talking about. If I can recognize a couple of words, I'll throw them in my own stuff, but I don't always follow the complicated jargon that the cultural studies people put in.
Yeah, that can definitely be a challenge. I mean, I would say that the study of sort of niche elements of tourism, yeah. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more, for example, in the history of dark tourism.
Yes, dark tourism.
Which will be really cool. Well, we're seeing it already coming out in article form, and hopefully we'll see books and so on too.
A couple of things that I've read lately are a couple of travelogues. So they're not histories. One is by Johnny Pitts called Afropean. He's a Black Briton, and he basically traveled all around Europe and just sort of kept diaries and wrote about it. It's excellent. It won a bunch of awards. It's called Afropeans. And then right now I'm reading this week a book called Minarets in the Mountains, which is getting a lot of press. He's also British. but of South Asian descent. And he basically goes on a family car tour in the Balkans, just sort of exploring Muslim Europe, where there've been, Muslim Europeans for a millennium. And he just sort of is on a road trip. And so in a different part of Europe that maybe many of us are not familiar with. And that's actually on my bedside table right now.
And Grant has a question.
Yeah, I had a question. How do you think what we've been through in the last 2 years with COVID is going to affect tourism?
Well, I'll start. I've been asked that a lot, and what I always tell reporters is that historians always predict the past only badly. We have no business predicting the future. So I try to punt. You know what? I'd like to think that it will make us be more mindful about tourism, that we'll think more about the impact on host communities, that we'll look for ways to be more sustainable. I mean, all the discussion of Venice and what's happened there. So, I mean, basically no native Italians can live in Venice anymore. They have to move further and further out because tourists have driven up costs so much that there's just no available real estate, and you have to have such a big income, it's impossible. And then, of course, the environmental impact. There was a New York Times article that I ended up quoting at one point that noted that when you're flying to the Alps to ski, you're doing more to add greenhouse gases to the environment to melt the glaciers you're going to ski on than in any other activity you could possibly do. So hopefully what'll happen is we've been without tourism for a bit. We've had a chance to think about it, and we'll ultimately change and try to do things more responsibly. I don't know that I'm super optimistic, but I hope. I don't think that we'll see people stop touring. I think that tourism will continue to grow. It's been growing pretty steadily with the exception of this brief interlude since 1950. And I think that we'll keep seeing that because it's become such a part of modern life and who we are. So I don't see us walking away from that.
I think we might see, and it's not just related to COVID, but it's part of it. I think we might see stricter border controls continuing to come into effect. I mean, we may have been in the last few decades sort of at our most border control free moment all over the world. We're seeing new restrictions being put in place, and it has to do with population movements, and the climate problems are going to exacerbate those as well. Keeping people out, even those who maybe intend to be tourists. This is going to be something that is going to be a tension. That tension of mobility, whether it's tourist mobility or migratory mobility, is going to be a pretty big deal, I think.
All right. Well, we're at 8 o'clock. I think that that's a great place to sort of leave the conversation. I want to thank you all for participating in this conversation. I found it delightful. I hope everybody else did as well. Unfortunately for Richard, Linda, and Eric, you're not close enough to come see my exhibit. But fly in, it's worth it. And for those of you who are here, please do come down and see it. And, one of the things we'll be doing is creating a online compendium of these stories to help further this research over time. And that'll be permanent, and it'll be part of the History Center's contribution to travel history. So thank you all. I really appreciate the time and all of your effort in helping us get here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.